If there was one type of game that I wish there was more of, it would be the shop management game. I'm a big fan of Swords and Potions 2, which I've spent more hours than I can count playing. But I've always felt there was so much more that can be done with the genre with a bit of creativity and imagination, and sure enough, with the game we're looking at today, someone has done exactly that. Moonlighter is an action-adventure game that combines the roguelike nature of The Binding of Isaac with the shop management gameplay. It is developed by Digital Sun and published by 11-Bit Studios. The game released May 29, 2018 for PC, PS4 and Xbox One. Moonlighter combines the two gameplays of the roguelike and the shop manager very well to create an entirely unique game, along with having beautiful art design and great atmosphere. But it suffers from pointless mechanics, lack of varied level design, lackluster plot, and zero longevity and replayability. I hope you're sitting comfortably, buckle up and have a nice cold drink and snack, because this is going to be a bumpy one. You take on the role of Will, the owner of a shop called Moonlighter that is based in the rundown village of Rhinoka. Despite working in and running Moonlighter being all that Will has ever known, he dreams of one day becoming a hero. On the outskirts of Rhinoka, there is a mysterious set of dungeons. It is here that Will goes to get the goods to sell in his store. Nobody knows or understands how the dungeons came to be, or what lays behind the mysterious and giant fifth door, and Will hopes to be the first person to discover its secrets. But to do that, he must first find the 4 keys required to unlock the door, and so his journey begins, as a shop owner by day and dungeon explorer by night. The plot to Moonlighter pretty much just follows Will in his journey to unlocking the 5th door, while also obtaining items to sell in his shop during the day. As you progress through each of the dungeons, you will find various notes from someone called Crazy Pete, a man who wants to uncover the mystery and origins surrounding the dungeons. These notes do fill in the gaps on how the dungeons work up until the climactic conclusion of how they came to be, which is discovered at the end of the game. As for the ending of the game itself, it comes as a double-edged sword. I found myself somewhat disappointed with the big reveal at the end of the game and how it played out. But at the same time, it leaves an opening for a very promising sequel with dozens of potential outcomes should it ever happen. It isn't a plot that is really designed to grip you, but rather written to give a setting and reason for the protagonist to want and need to go to the dungeons, along with a beginning and end to the game. And while the notes provide some form of the plot in the middle, it isn't enough to call it plot progression. So essentially, as a plot, it has a beginning and an end, but nothing in between that. So while intriguing to a degree, there just isn't enough to really hook you for the 8 to 12 hour duration of the game. I found my mind just drifted away from the plot, what little there is, while I focused on the gameplay. And if it is the gameplay you want to experience more than anything with Moonlighter, then you might be in with a bit of luck. Might be. The gameplay to Moonlighter is separated primarily into 2 different forms, that being the Binding of Isaac roguelike combat and exploration, along with the shop management where you run a shop pricing items and placing them on sale for customers to buy. First up is the roguelike gameplay. This essentially works exactly the same as the Binding of Isaac, but with a bit of enter the gungeon dodging and rolling. You start off by first entering the first dungeon, with the others unlocking one by one as you progress through the game. Each dungeon is unique with its own environment, theme, enemies and items to be found, and each contains a total of 3 floors that must be explored, where you must defeat the boss found on the 3rd floor. Each floor works like the Binding of Isaac in that you move from room to room killing all the enemies within them to be able to progress to the next. There are also secret rooms that can be found by jumping down into the pits that are in certain rooms, but only those where you see white sparkling stars for a second or two upon entering the room actually lead to a secret one. If you get it wrong, you end up taking damage and spawning back at the entrance to the room. These rooms contain items. Sometimes you'll find a chest that sends all items you put into it back to your shop, and other times you'll find a spawn room, which are rooms that contain chests with items where you need to kill all the enemies to open them. You can spawn enemies into the room up to 4 times, increasing in difficulty each time but granting you better reward chests. As I said, it is essentially the same as the Binding of Isaac, just with a bit of Moonlighter's own charm added into it, such as the quite unique secret rooms, but that is where the comparison to the Binding of Isaac ends. As you progress through the dungeon obtaining items from monsters and chests, you will quickly find that your bag fills up. In total, you can only have up to 20 stacks of items in your inventory at any one time. Certain items only have a stack of up to 5, while others have 10. Weapons and armor are not stackable at all. At the start of the game, you will find a mirror that when an item is placed into it, turns it into gold equal to a small percentage of its actual worth. It is very useful for getting a bit of gold for items that you either can't carry or don't want, and stops you from leaving them behind. It is also useful for getting the gold needed to use Will's pendant that allows him to travel back to town in exchange for a certain amount of money. The tougher the dungeon and the deeper you are in it, the more gold it costs to activate. Along with that, there is also an additional item that works in similar fashion, which is the teleport cube. This allows you to activate a portal that not only brings you back to town, but keeps the portal open for you to return to exactly where you were. This is extremely useful when deeper in a dungeon, but costs a lot more to activate than the pendant. Having these items at your disposal all the time is extremely useful. It allows for you to travel back to town to unload your bags whenever you want, as long as you have the money to activate them. It also makes you plan out and think about what items to bring with you and what you need to destroy and turn into gold. The only criticism I have is that they are the only items in this part of the gameplay that you unlock. The other dungeons don't contain any further items like this at all, so there are no additional exciting moments of discovery like that which you get when you find these items, and it's a bit disappointing. One of the biggest challenges with the inventory is that when obtaining items from a chest, they often have one of several types of curses on them. Some of these curses mean you can only place the item in a certain location in your bag, for example the slots on the sides or on the top or bottom. Other curses have more direct and impacting effects of both positive and negative nature. For example, some are teleport curses, which when placed in your bag, the item in the direction that the curse is taking effect will be teleported back to your shop, making a space available. Another curse is one that allows you to break the curse on another item, while others result in items being destroyed if hit too many times, or changing what an item is, or destroying an adjacent item completely upon returning to town. Some items have an unidentified curse on them, meaning you will only know what the item is upon returning to town or breaking the curse. Having the curses works pretty well for the most part, as it makes you think about what items to keep and how you can work the curses in your favour as opposed to them being a hindrance to you. But while it works well from the perspective of inventory management, it does slow down the overall gameplay dramatically. About a third, if not half of your time spent in a dungeon will be moving around and sorting out your inventory because of the curses. And quite frankly, it gets a bit old and tiresome after a while. Overall, the inventory management works pretty well. It has some pretty neat mechanics that genuinely work, even if they do have the downfall of slowing down the gameplay quite a lot. But if you have the patience to conquer that issue, you will find yourself enjoying it. Then there is the combat. Each enemy has its own attacks and behaviour that you need to learn in order to kill them while remaining unshaved yourself. These patterns aren't too difficult to figure out, and with the ability to dodge roll, it allows for easy enough avoidance of enemy attacks and projectiles. Along with that, there are numerous different types of weapons you get to use in combat, each having its own advantage, disadvantage and special ability. For example, with a sword and a shield you can use the shield to block projectiles, with a spear you can do a running charge attack, and so on and so forth. And using the different weapons and all their ups and downs can be more useful in some situations and against certain enemies, resulting in there being some form of tactics to the combat. The biggest issue with the combat is that the enemies are just too predictable. Once you have their behaviour and attack patterns learned, there is nothing stopping you from beating them with ease, unless you are extremely careless. The same applies to the bosses of the game too. Once you have their attacks down, they become extremely easy to defeat, making them a bit underwhelming. I also have to add that the later bosses in the game also have far more predictable patterns and are easier to kill than the early game bosses too. While the combat is indeed functional and the controls are responsive even on a keyboard, it just feels lacking when compared to the combat of so many other roguelikes. For starts, it is far slower than I was expecting, and the enemies are too predictable as they only have one attack and you have plenty of time to prepare for it. And the same again applies to the bosses. Even though they have numerous attacks, the combat is so slow that it gives you plenty of time to prepare for them once you have the pattern down. Along with that, it just isn't very impactful when you hit an enemy. It never feels like you're hurting them, and the only feedback you get is a flash and the damage number. It's just really underwhelming. The best way to sum up the combat for Moonlighter would be to call it basic and old. It is a format that has been done to death and a whole lot better in other games. It is the kind of combat that isn't bad, it's just a bit bland. It doesn't excite nor do you detest it. It just does the job and that's about it. Another problem with this area of the gameplay is the level design. Indeed, each dungeon is unique, environmentally, atmospherically, and with the enemies it presents, but the problem is that there's no variety. Once you've entered and completed a dungeon, you will have already seen everything there is to see. Every time you enter a dungeon, it is the same rooms as before, just in a different order. There is no reason to keep playing the dungeons over and over, other than to get the materials you need that are unique to each one. And once you've entered a dungeon a number of times, it very quickly becomes monotonous. Along with that, while each of the dungeons look different, they don't offer up that much difference in the actual design. So each dungeon, despite having its own theme, is pretty much the same as the last. And it just means that there's no replayability for the game at all. And for a game that's gameplay is centered around replayability, this is a sin. And it just adds to the blandness of the combat and exploration. Finally, it is time to get into the shop management of the game. Essentially how this works is you place an item on one of the stands and then price it. When a customer comes along and looks at the item, they will give one of 4 possible responses to the price. The first is a happy face with gold coins for eyes. This means the item is being sold at a bargain price. The second is a happy face, meaning the item is at a fair price. The third is a frustrated face, meaning the item is a bit overpriced but they're willing to pay it. The fourth is an exasperated face, meaning the item is way overpriced and they will just leave it and move on to another item. You need to adjust the prices of the items in accordance with these responses, as you want to make the most money you can out of each of the items. And there is an item log that keeps track of all the prices and responses you get from each and every item for easy records, which is an absolute godsend. This mechanic works pretty well and is fun trying to figure out what the best price is for an item where you can make the most out of it. The problem is, much like the inventory management in the game, having to keep switching prices really slows down the gameplay. But again, if you have the patience, it is an easy issue to press through. Along with that, the more of a particular item you sell, the less popular it becomes. What is supposed to happen here is that when you're selling a less popular item, customers will only buy it when at a lower price, and an item that is in high demand you can sell for a higher price, or at least that's the impression I got from the tutorial. The problem is this doesn't happen at all. Even items that are low in popularity are still bought by customers even at higher prices and at the same frequency as other items. So if that mechanic was supposed to be in the game, it seems it isn't working. And if it is working as intended, the whole idea of it is pointless, as it doesn't make the slightest difference in customer behaviour. While the shop is open, you also get thieves that enter attempting to steal products off the stands. These individuals are easy to notice, as when they enter they have a particular icon over their head for a few seconds. Not only that, they have very distinctive physical appearances. When they do take something, you need to roll into them before they exit the shop. Succeed and you get the item installed back, and the thief does a runner. The idea of having thieves coming into the shop is a neat one. That works reasonably well to add a bit of difficulty to the shop management of the game. The issue with this is that they're so distinctive that they stick out like a sore thumb. All you need to do is watch them and wait until they take something and then make your move to stop them. The shop even later in the game is never so busy that it becomes a challenge in stopping customers from stealing, and it ends up just being more of an annoyance than adding to the game. Then there are the shop and town upgrades. At the start of the game you will only have a very small shop available to you with 4 item stands along with basic equipment. As you progress through the game you unlock more upgrades, such as increasing the size of your shop, allowing for more items to be sold at one time. Along with that you can upgrade your cash register that increases the tips that customers give, the bed that grants you additional temporary health, your storage allowing for more items to be stored, and your bargain bin where you can place more items at a discount. All these upgrades except the bargain bin are very useful and worth investing in, as they greatly help you in all their unique ways. As for the bargain bin, this goes back to the item popularity problem I previously mentioned. With this not working, there's no need for a bargain bin. Throughout the entirety of the game, no matter the popularity of an item, I still sold it for the most I could, and not once did I ever use the bargain bin. So just like the mechanic I'm assuming it is centered around, it is completely pointless. As you upgrade your shop, new mechanics become available to you. Once you have the third upgrade, you will have a shop assistant who will help in catching thieves, along with running the shop during the day if you want to go to the dungeons instead of manning the shop. This comes at a 30% cost of your overall income for the day. It is a nice little addition, but like a few of the features in Moonlighter, is another one that I never really used, as I found there to be no need to. Along with that, customers will start coming in placing orders for specific items. These are essentially optional quests where they will look for 5 of this item or 10 of that item, and you need to do it in a set number of days in exchange for a set amount of gold. In honesty, this mechanic stinks of last minute implementation. The reason for this is that it is woefully unbalanced. At the point of the game that this feature becomes available, the rewards for the quests are just not worth the time and effort to complete them. With what rewards you are being given, you would receive for 1 stack of an item at this stage of the game. Sure, it gives you something new to do, but very often the quests are associated with a dungeon you have already completed. It just feels like a last minute idea to add a little bit more content and busy work to the game to make it last longer, and results in it being unrewarding and just not worth the effort. Then there are the town upgrades. These centre around bringing new businesses to the town, including a blacksmith for weapons and armour, an alchemist for potions and weapon and armour enchanting, a retailer to buy materials from, a decorator to buy new decor for your shop, and finally a banker. It is with the alchemist and blacksmith that the crafting in the game comes into play. How it works is that every item requires a number of specific materials. You bring these materials to the shop and they will make the item for you for a price. With the blacksmith there are 3 different types of armours, one that is lighter and grants less defence but movement is faster, one that is heavier and slows you down a bit, and then finally the one that is balanced between the two. As for the weapons, there are swords and shields, spears, gloves, bows and great swords. How the crafting works is that with the armour, for example, the different types of armour has 3 parts to them, and 4 more powerful variations of the starting versions of them. Think of the variations of them as levels, starting from level 1 to 5 being the max. To make a level 1 piece of armour you will need the materials required plus paying the price for the service. To upgrade that to level 2 you will first need to have the level 1 piece of armour in your inventory plus the materials and the money for the service. So this means that even when you have unlocked the recipes to craft a level 5 piece of armour, you will still need to craft a level 1, 2, 3 and 4 piece of armour before being able to craft a level 5. If you wanted to craft a level 5 armour to sell in your shop, you will have the arduous job of getting the materials from all 4 dungeons before being able to craft it, or to buy the materials from the retailer for an obnoxious amount of money where it would be impossible to make a profit. And it works exactly the same way for weapons too. You need to craft them one by one before being able to craft a top tier weapon. Like a lot of things in Moonlighter, the crafting is a double-edged sword. From the perspective of the player progression, it makes perfect sense, as it means you cannot become overpowered too early in the game. You need to do it step by step as you progress. But from a shop management perspective, it is a whole lot of work for a very minimal return. And because of this, 99.9% of all your sales are actually items you get from the dungeon as opposed to weapons or armour. Through the whole game I only sold a literal handful of weapons and armour, because they were just too much work when I was already making an absolute fortune just selling items from the dungeon. So it works in one way but is a hindrance in another. As for the enchanting of weapons and armour, you simply bring the item to the alchemist where you'll need enchanting crystals along with paying for the service. The lower end weapons of the game can only be enchanted once, but higher weapons that you get later in the game can be enchanted multiple times, and it becomes essential to do this in order to keep up with the health and defense of later enemies in the game. It is a very basic enchantment system, but one that works really well, but only serves a purpose for you personally, as it won't increase the value of weapons or armour for the purpose of selling, as there aren't slots in your price books for upgrade versions of the weapons and armour. Then there is the banker, which, much like the optional quest feature of the game, feels like it was put into it at the very last minute. Essentially how the banker works is you invest a certain amount of money to him and he works his magic in attempting to increase your investment. Each day for a week the value of your investment will either increase or decrease. At any point during those 7 days you can withdraw your investment. If you leave it beyond the 7 days you will lose it completely. For example, on day 1 your investment could go down by 1%, day 2 it could be up 4%, day 3 it could be down 2%, and so on and so forth. You need to leave it with the banker while it is going bad and withdraw it as soon as it's looking like it's going anyway good. Again, it is something new to do in the game, but the return for doing it just isn't worth the time and bother of having to go back to the banker every day hoping that you're not in the red. I invested about $250,000 into the banker, and after 4 days I was only making a profit of about 3%. That is only about 7,000 or 8,000 in profit. It just makes the whole rigmarole pointless. Finally is the decorator, where you can buy new decorations for your shop that grant additional bonuses to it. The more dungeons you complete, the more decorations will become available, and the bigger your shop is, the more decorations you can display at any one time. The bonuses they grant are increased customer speed, increasing opening time, increasing the maximum number of customers in the shop, increased customer payout with tips, decrease the number of thieves coming into the shop, increase the chance of generous customers, and finally an increase in time to complete the optional quests for customers. It is a neat little mechanic, but like so many others, it is almost entirely pointless. The only actual bonus that is of any use to you is the payout of tips, as with that you gain huge amounts of money for items when it is very high. The problem with this being so useful is that it essentially breaks the balancing of the game, giving you more money than you would ever need. The reason the other bonuses are useless is that the customer speed isn't a problem to begin with. The opening time of the store is perfectly long enough. The number of customers you get in a shop in a day is about the right amount, so increasing isn't needed. The thieves are of so little threat there is no need to decrease their numbers, and the optional quests are so pointless and unrewarding as a system that it isn't worth even accepting the quest to begin with. So yes, the only actual bonus that is useful breaks the balancing of the game, while the other 7 are not of any use to you at all. It is just another mechanic that is hastily put in without much thought of its usefulness or the consequences of its addition. Overall, the gameplay to Moonlighter has major ups and downs. It is unique and offers an experience like no other, but there are signs of development struggles. The combat is a bit too basic, the level design isn't varied enough, there are tons of pointless mechanics that don't aid or reward the player in any way or enhance the game. But with that said, the gameplay does just about enough that it isn't a disaster, nor is it bland or boring as a whole. You never truly feel any exhilaration, but it does enough that it is worth playing at least once, for the experience and uniqueness of it. Just don't expect a masterpiece. If there is one thing about Moonlighter where I can give utmost positivity, it will be the atmosphere. Throughout the entire game, from the shop to the village to each of the unique dungeons and their themes, the atmosphere is simply brilliant. The soundtrack that plays in every instance fits so perfectly. For example, the Desert Dungeon has a kind of Aladdin or Arabian Nights kind of tune going through it, while the Tech World has a slight techno note to it, and the other dungeons are equally as fitting for their theme. To be honest, the atmosphere is so well done that it is part of what carries Moonlighter throughout. Without it, I don't think the game would have offered enough for me to finish it, and it is nothing but a joy from beginning to end. Moonlighter is one of those games that is very difficult to review properly, as there's just so much to memorise and talk about and so many different opinions for each aspect of it. There is no denying, Moonlighter has a lot of problems. It is clear it has had a rough development history, where the deadline resulted in there being some major cuts along with the rushed last minute implementation of various broken or pointless mechanics and features. It is a game that feels unfinished and that it was originally planned to be something more than it actually is. But with that said, despite its problems, by a very thin margin, it does just about enough to stop it from entering that dreaded flatline territory of mediocrity. And with that, I give Moonlighter a 6 out of 10. Is Moonlighter worth the $20 asking price? Well, yeah. What saves the game from disaster and actually does make it worth its price tag is its uniqueness and atmosphere. Without them, it would have gotten a far bigger hammering than I have already given it. It is a game that is very much a testing of the water, and I would love to see a sequel that refines and corrects the issues that Moonlighter has, while expanding on what can be learned from it. But until then, all I can hope is that the developers can fix as many of the issues that the game has as possible.